is shrouded in a spider web of lies. Isn't this America? Or is this America all a lie?
Of the freedom of speech, somewhere I read. Of the freedom of press, somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right.
How can I pledge allegiance to a country built on lies? Raise my children to believe they're equal in its eyes. My leaders are assassinated for speaking their mind. So justice never tilts my way. I thought that she was blind. Isn't this America? Or is this America all a lie?
Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop.
Good day. I am Denise DePina-Reed, co-host of At the Round Table with Mamleo, a Massachusetts Association Minority Law Enforcement Officers Incorporated broadcast, and we greatly appreciate our sponsors, John B. Cruz Construction Company, 1 John Elliott Square, Roxbury, Massachusetts, third-generation family-owned, founded in 1948, to provide superior customer service and a quality product for its clients and tenants. Everyone's going green, and you should too. That's the law offices of Donald E. Green, located in the heart of Roxbury at 2235 Washington Street in Dudley Square, soon to be called Nubian Square, 617-442-0050, and also 500 North Main Street, Unit B, Randolph, Massachusetts, 02386. Last but not least, our newest sponsor, Residential Mortgages Services, will guide you home. 91 Franklin Street, Boston, Massachusetts, 02110. Contact Senior Loan Officer Cora Holbrook at 781-664-6200. That's Cora.Holbrook at rmsmortgage.com. Without their sponsorship, this broadcast would not be possible. Thank you and have a great day.
Well, good morning. We're back. This is Boston Praise Radio at the Round Table with Mamleo. I am your host, Denise DePina-Reed, with my co-host, Dr. Willie Bradley, and our guest, Ricardo Arroyo, candidate for Boston City Council, the 5th District. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, sister. How you doing today?
Good morning.
Fine.
Thank you for having me on.
You're quite welcome. So, Mr. Arroyo, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So I was born and raised in Hyde Park. My parents, Elsa Montano, my dad, Felix Arroyo. My mom was a teacher for about 30 years in the Boston Public Schools. I'm a product of BPS, and my dad has served in a variety of different roles, from the school committee to the city council to now in his current role as the Register of Probate. And what they really instilled in me growing up was that service is the rent we pay for the blessing of being on earth. And so I was always trying to figure out how to serve. And so one of the things that I did when I was in high school, I was coaching youth sports. I was coming into contact with children who were going through things at the age of 13, 14, that really no 13 or 14-year-olds should have to go through. We had children who were homeless. We lost some children to violence. And so I started thinking about ways that I could use, the education that I was getting to serve them. And so I went to law school to be a public defender. And then I came back and I did that work. And so I was a public defender in Massachusetts with the Committee for Public Counsel Services for 4 years. And in doing that work, I loved that work. I got to be honest. I have nothing but fond memories for that. We have a really unjust system in the way that it works for penalizing folks who are living in poverty, people who have mental illnesses, and have addiction issues. And part of the issue with it is that, we had a system that was largely and still is essentially guided towards incarceration. It's a one-size-fits-all solution that doesn't actually fit all. And so when I was doing that work, I got to do a lot of individual work, helping folks find treatment centers, finding folks find housing, helping folks find jobs. But the issue that I was grappling with on a daily basis was that, no matter how much of that work I was doing, we still had the same amount of folks coming in the next day. I still had to worry about the lack of support systems in place for a lot of my clients when the case was over. And so we had a lot of those kinds of issues where I started to dig deeper in myself and figure out how could I serve a larger population, how can I deal with some of these policy issues, how can I deal with some of the systematic issues that I just wasn't able to address as a public defender. And I saw the Boston City Council as an opportunity to fight for funding, to make sure that programs are getting the funding that they require, to make sure that we're putting things in place to create more affordable housing, to make sure we're fighting for an education that's fully funded. So that was an opportunity for me to take what I was doing as a public defender and build it out towards the whole community. And so that's why I ran. That's basically what I'm about. If you ask me why I'm doing it and where I'm coming from, that I think answers that.
Yeah, I'd asked you before because after, I've known your family for a minute, your brother, your dad, and I just asked you out there, after all that's been said and done, and to your brother Felix and to your dad, I'm sure someone had to ask you, and if they didn't, I'm the troublemaker. I'm going to ask you, why?
So, I remember when I was, when you're an attorney and you're doing the work I was doing, people would ask me genuinely, when are you going to run? Why aren't you running? And I used to say no, and I meant that, like with my whole heart when I was saying it. And part of it for me was when you serve the community, so for instance, in the case of my father, a lot of my growing up with my father was going to community meetings, going to city school committee meetings, because when you're doing work for the community, it honestly does create a harder time for you to go back and be with family. And so a lot of what I was thinking about was in preparation for having my own family and wanting to make sure that I had the right amount of time with my family and with work. And I think what I learned from both of them is that the service is required of us as human beings, and however anybody wants to do that service makes sense. In my case, I know that the road my dad hoed and my brother, in terms of the work that they did, was valuable. I mean, I run into people now who come up to me and say, your brother was the reason why I have heat in my house. When it was the winter of like 2011, I got heat in my house because I called your brother's office and he handled that. Or I have, when I was in Mattapan, I recently had somebody who said, the first time I felt valued as an immigrant was when I spoke with your father and I saw the work your father was doing. And so that resonates with me. And I know that there's other lanes, but I feel like the work that I saw them do up close, the exposure that I had to what was happening, the knowledge that I have of how these systems work and how they work essentially to, at times, oppress and exclude, qualifies me to do this work in a way that not everybody is qualified to do. And so that's why I threw my hat in the ring, even though I know that, it comes with, I grew up reading, Howie Carr used to call my dad subtitles. In the paper, right? Like I grew up reading that when I was in 6th, 5th, 4th grade, and so I'm aware of what the public, what comes with it when you're in the public arena. But I think the work is so important that I'm willing to do that, and I'm happy to do that. And so I don't go into it blind. I know that I'm walking into a situation where you're up for scrutiny. Everything you do, you're now a public person. In a way where I maybe wasn't a public person before, but I'm prepared to do that because the problems are urgent. So it's not something I did lightly. Okay. I can tell you that.
Okay.
I'm sitting here listening to you, and I'm saying, wow, that's very courageous, being an individual who have come up and raised up into, in a family that has provided public service, people that your father, your brother, involved in. So you have a pretty good understanding of what you're getting yourself into, but yet you're willing to run right into that wall. So I commend you on that. So let's talk a little bit about how you feel about things that are happening around,
Absolutely.
around in the city.
Yep.
That, you know, things like gentrification, things like education. What are some of the ideas that you have you can share with our listening audience
Yep.
about how you see our education system going in the city of Boston? What can you do differently? What do you think that we should do?
So, one of the major, so I'm a BPS graduate. I went to the Sarah Greenwood, the Timothy, and then the O'Brien. Oh,
yeah, I went to Sarah
yeah,
Greenwood.
so I
back
went
in
to the
six-
Sarah Greenwood.
I went back in the 60s. Though.
See, I went to the Sarah Greenwood.
Yeah.
The building is probably the same.
Yeah, yeah. But you know, there's a lot of balls up on the top of the roof. We used to play kickball up there.
Oh, that's actually a strong kick.
Oh yeah, it's a very strong kick.
It's a strong kick.
I had it when I was a kid, but I don't have it now though. But
Yeah.
anyway.
So I went to the Sarah Greenwood, and then I went to the Timothy, and then I went to the O'Brien. And one of the things that always struck me was we only had, so for instance, I use the O'Brien. The O'Brien, we had about 2,100 students. We had 2 guidance counselors.
Wow.
Wow.
Right? And so the ratios, and that's an exam school. And so when we talk about what's happening right now where they're fighting for funding so that we can have nurses in every school and we can have guidance counselors in every school, part of what I was always aware of it because I was going to Boston Public Schools. I became really aware of it. So I went to Chicago for law school. I went to the University of Chicago. And I was there when they were closing the schools. And I became really aware because I entered in that fight. I was on picket lines with a lot of those folks. I learned there in a way that I understood, but it became essentially, I'd seen it, now I knew, and I saw the studies for it. I'd lived through it, now I saw the studies. We're dealing with a lot of PTSD and trauma in our youth. Because there's a lot that happens in their lives, whether it's violence in their neighborhoods, whether it's dysfunction at home. But the resources that you would give somebody to cope with that, that we have adults who suffer with coping mechanisms for these things. And so when you're not arming our children with guidance counselors or nurses or social supports, you can't really expect them to fully exceed in an education system. And so for me, I look at our education system holistically. And what I like to tell folks is, when I run into folks who were at Cranbrook, the private school out in Michigan, or Exeter, or Philip Andover Day Academy, or Milton, they didn't reinvent education over there. They just fully funded it. And so every year when I was in BPS, it felt like it was like, how do we reinvent education? How do we make it more effective? Because what they were really trying to do was, how do we get by underfunding this? How can we get them to do more? How can we cut some corner somewhere and have our teachers do more with less? Right? And that's all that reinventing education ever meant to me. So one of my major things would be fighting for fully funding. Right now, it's a good time for that because you have the Promise Bill, and folks are fighting for that. I would like to see that done. In terms of the affordable housing neighborhood displacement, it's pretty horrific right now. I was paying over 50% of my rent, but my paycheck was rent. When it came to the affordable housing metrics and how we determine what affordable housing is, I couldn't afford that at all. That was like 60% of my paycheck to live in a studio apartment, and that was the affordable housing unit. And so as we move forward, I know that Lydia Edwards has put together a bill on speculation taxes. I was actually kicking around the idea of what would be known as a vacancy tax. I think Tito Jackson, former city councilor Tito Jackson, has kicked around this idea as well. But it would be a tax on units above a certain amount in terms of cost that are vacant. And if you look at the Seaport, I think they did a study on that where it's like 70% of those units are vacant. They're bought for all kinds of reasons. I think that same study found like 20 or 30% of it was money laundering, right? Wow. So in terms of I think there's a tax incentive that if you don't claim it, you should be able to pay a vacancy tax on this unit, and then that money can go towards figuring out how we handle certain affordable housing things. Linkage fees need to be raised. There needs to be a creation of affordable housing that actually hits middle income families and working families. I found that it's very difficult when you're making an income between, say, $40,000 and $70,000 to find any way to find a place to stay in Boston, because if you're looking for affordable housing, generally they're asking for over 50% of your paycheck at that point. And what's happening is, people talk about, well, we need to get into home ownership. I would love to have gotten into home ownership, but when you're paying over 50% of your income to rent, how are you going to put down the down payment required to actually do that? And so, these are things that don't necessarily work in tandem. And the district that I'm looking to represent, which is Mattapan, Hyde Park, and Rosendale's faced a lot of neighborhood displacement. Mattapan and Hyde Park are starting to face neighborhood displacement because development hasn't moved south the same way that it's hit East Boston or it's hit Roxbury or it's hit the more central, closer to downtown neighborhoods. And so my goal here, and I tell folks all the time, if gentrification was going to be solved by one smart person, it'd have been done already, right? It came through San Francisco, it came through New York, it's been in Boston for a while. I see it as more of a holistic approach. How do we do a bunch of different things with a bunch of different people to try and solve this issue? Because as we move into our neighborhoods now, District 5 is perhaps one of the few districts in the city that is actually working from a preventative situation rather than how do we deal with a situation that's already in full blast. And so I'm trying to figure out ways that we can work with the community and in partnership with the city council colleagues that would be there to make sure that we're putting in programming and planning and ordinances that help cut costs, that help make sure that we're creating affordable housing for those districts, while still preventing the displacement that our other neighborhoods have really seen in full blast.
Have you seen the housing court? There was a time when there were, one or two, three, maybe four people in eviction court. Now they're out the door and around the corner.
Yep.
And when you see the people in it, grandmothers.
Yeah, no, that's the problem.
How do you put out a 74, 77-year-old woman?
It's called greed.
Yeah, it is. But there's got to be something. You've got families in there. You've got the elderly in there. And like I said, I've never seen anything like it.
No, it's bad. There used to be a time, I think, when Housing Court wasn't even open every day of the week.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. There wasn't anybody in it. And it wasn't open, and now it's just overflowing. And the amount of money that they want for these houses. I've got a house next door to me that's going for $900,000.
Yeah,
it's across the street, and it's not even a house; it's a condo.
Well, I wanted to go back to the to his hit on education, because he mentioned about full funding and having teachers do more with less. Which is another way of saying, and I agree with you, we're not going to fund your school completely, but we're going to keep you. Yeah. But we're not going to fund your school completely. So you're going to have to wear multiple caps.
Yes.
And you're going to have to get into areas where you may not be necessarily skilled in that area, or you may not have the expertise in that area,
or the training.
But we're going to make sure that what you have to do it. And so what happens with that is that it becomes a disservice to our students. Our students, what we're producing out of the Boston Public School System can no longer compete in a world market. Can no longer compete in an academic setting where they're competing for seats like Illinois, University of Chicago Law School, or Walden University, all those different places where we go to get our advanced degrees.
Yep.
So we're doing a disservice. So I know we got to call it, but my hit was, yes, we can full fund, but we have to also make sure that the people that we're putting in there in those offices or in those positions are held accountable to do the job that they need to get done, to make sure that our kids are serviced, because ultimately the kids are who are losing out. We have a caller?
Yes, caller, you're on the air.
Good morning. How y'all doing this morning?
Good morning, Terrence.
Doing very well. How are you?
Good morning. Yeah, good morning, Mr. Roy. How are you?
Doing well. Good morning.
All right. Glad to see you're following your brother and his father's footsteps. That's good. But I just want to know, because when we have a whole lot of people who coming out to run for office,
it
seems like they follow on a script of what to say, what not to say, what to do, and what not to do. We have a whole lot saying, okay, their number one issue is education and crime. But once they get into office, that whole focus is gone. What's your focus on what's going on in our community as far as the crime, with our youth that are out here, engaged in all this activity that's hurting our community. What platform, do you plan to bring to City Council to try to, stop everything or have an impact on helping these young men and women out here?
Thank you for your question. And so, I tell folks to look at what I've been about, what I've done. And as a public defender, this is actually a very near and dear issue for me, right? I've represented some of these children. When I was mentoring youth, I've dealt with a lot of these children. When I was going to BPS, these were my colleagues, like my peers and some of my friends. And so what I always kept with me that I know to be true is that everybody I knew who was involved in street life in any form, whether it was violence, whether it was actually selling drugs, whether it was robbery or whatever was happening that would be essentially criminal. That wasn't where they wanted to be. They felt sort of trapped into it. They felt like it was something where they didn't have any options, they didn't have any choices. And so this was the choice that they felt like they had to follow. For me, when I'm doing work as a public defender, we talk about this internally in the office, but my policy is I'm client-centered, so my goal is always to figure out where is my client coming from, what can I do to help them, what do they need, what do they want, what are they asking me for. In terms of how do we kind of put an end or push back on some of the street elements, I think we have to really look at what kind of opportunities are we offering folks to get out, right? Jobs Not Jails talks a lot about this, but basically what we're talking about is people need employment, people need a way forward and a way out. Education in terms of higher education may not be what everybody wants, but we don't have a vocational school system that's meeting our needs right now. And when you go into the vocations, you're actually getting paid, in some cases six figures to do work with your hands, work that a lot of folks would do if they knew that they could get into it. And we don't have a pipeline for any of that. We have Operation Exit was a program we used to send our kids to if we could get them in there. But there's not a lot of programs for that. So part of what I would be looking into is funding. How are we dealing with folks who have mental illness that's being undiagnosed because they don't have guidance counselors working with them? They don't have nurses recognizing that this is somebody who may be dealing with a mental illness that's undiagnosed, whether it be bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, whether it be anxiety or high amounts of depression, and how is that affecting their ability to cope or be a productive citizen? And if we don't have safeguards in place to essentially do interruption of what they're currently doing, then we're not really doing what we have to do. I think right now there's been a big push in mentorship programming, right? We have there's a big push in how do we create mentoring for our youth, and I think that's a key component. But I also think that a key component is making sure that we have youth jobs, making sure that we have the resources required to deal with folks who are dealing with anxiety and PTSD and depression and these other things that in our community we often don't get the resources to deal with or to address. And I think from the city council level, where you're dealing with the city council budget, you're able to kind of push some of that budget towards, well, I know you can, I've seen it done, you can push it towards youth jobs, you can push it towards certain programming. And so my hope is to do some interruption in that way. I think really when you see somebody who's doing something that's not productive as a citizen, it's largely, I got to be honest, I've represented hundreds of people. I don't think I ever met anybody who wanted to be in the situation that they were when I found them at a district court or a superior court. I never met anybody who was like, this is what I do, I'm really proud of this is what I want to keep doing. It was usually folks who were struggling with addiction, were struggling with mental illness, were struggling with homelessness, and so maybe they were doing robbery or selling to deal with their addiction or to deal with the fact that they had nowhere to sleep, and this was how they were paying their bills, or they had family, and they were trying to figure out how do I provide for a family without, being offered the education that I should have gotten. And so there's a number of different things that are going on when you talk about crime. I think there's a number of different things that go into that. And I always start from the principle that I truly believe nobody wants to be about that life. Nobody really wants to be there. And so if you start from there, then you can start to figure out, well, what brought them here how do we address what's bringing them here? And in some cases, it's a searching for safety. In some cases, it's untreated mental illness. In some cases, it's poverty. In some cases, it's they didn't receive the education that they should have gotten, or the opportunities that should have been made available to them. And so, I think part of the issue, I think you brought up that politicians have kind of a script and then they don't do it. A lot of this is, my clients, they don't vote, right? Like if you're dealing with somebody who's dealing with addiction, somebody who's dealing with homelessness, somebody who doesn't even have an address to vote from, that's not allowed what we would call constituency, right? They're not, they're not really calling your office. And so if you're going to do work in that community and in those arenas, you have to be aware that you're doing that work not because you're getting votes, but because it's the right thing morally and ethically and from a justice standpoint as a human being to be doing. And so that's my goal, is to do that work. I've seen up close as a public defender what it means to not receive the resources you should be receiving. In Boston, when the net worth for a white family is $250,000 and the net worth for a black family is $8, that's systematic. That's systemic. That's by design. And so what I see my role as a city councilor, or as just a human being, is to advocate on behalf of changing those systems, because those systems are doing what they were designed to do. My role is to interrupt those systems, and it's similar to when I see violence on the streets or when I see folks struggling with addiction on the streets. My role is to try to provide an interruption to the systems and the issues that these folks are facing. But I always start from the principle that they're people, they're human beings, they don't want to be in this situation. I've never really met any of those folks that I was in close proximity with who were, and it goes from the gamut. It goes from assault and batteries to folks who were dealing with drug addiction. None of them ever wanted to be in the life that they were living. They felt trapped in that life. They felt like they didn't have options in that life. And unfortunately, in a lot of ways, our systems failed them because they weren't providing any options for them. And when you have waiting lists for treatment centers and you have waiting lists for homeless shelters, we have to do better. And so I see my role as creating those opportunities, or at a minimum, making sure that I'm advocating for the creation of those opportunities if for some reason the system's not allowing it to happen until we get them. And so I see that as my role.
Okay. That's pretty good. Well, I know. I just want to promote. A group was started last week called the Peacemakers, where a bunch of black men, Spanish men, came out, and we walked the streets last week where our elder was taken.
Yep, that was Mattapan.
Yeah, up in Mattapan. And so we started that. So we vowed for every Saturday at 12 o'clock. We're gonna meet at Muhammad's Mosque at 12 o'clock. A bunch of us. If you got something orange, wear it. If not, just come on out. And we would like for you to come up there and join us and walk with us as we walk Columbia Road. To help ease everything that's going on in our community. We can't always depend on Boston Police Department and the city of Boston to stop what's going on in our community. If we call it our hood, our street, then we need to, protect our hood and our street. So we need for, if you would like, come on out. We'll be at Muhammad's Mosque at 12 o'clock. Just come on out, bring who you want to bring. Everybody's welcome, to walk these streets to try to save our kids,
And what day was this?
Excuse me?
What day did you say this was?
Today.
Oh, today.
Every Saturday. Yeah, every Saturday. It's going to be every Saturday for now. Until, if we can gather more men, then we're going to, try to do, every day, just an hour. We're telling folks, we're not trying to take your whole day. We're not trying to take, your whole week. But, 1 hour of doing something is better than 24 hours of doing nothing.
Yep.
So if everybody, who's really sincere about saving our youth, saving our streets, saving our elders, come on out and join us. Because we're coming in peace. We're not coming, to disrupt, to start no fight, to start no war. We're coming, to educate, to save, and to love, our youth and our people.
I commend the work you do.
Thank you very much, and Mr. Pina and young fellow over there. Thank y'all for what y'all do, and thank you for sounding that trumpet.
Yeah,
We appreciate y'all.
I appreciate that, Doc. I appreciate the young part too. I really do.
All right, thanks,
Yeah, at 60 years old, 60-something years old, I do appreciate that. But yet, nevertheless, I hear you. School is a big piece. The police department is the big piece of what people are concerned about, as well as gentrification is a huge piece.
Yep. And more in line, with gentrification is the fact that gentrification is essentially pushing out residents, and even in the situations where it's not pushing out residents, like in Mattapan, I've run into a group of folks. Like just every time I'm out, folks who say, I'm not selling my house. I live here. I'm not selling my house. I don't care how expensive my house goes up on the market. But their issue is their families, the children that they've raised in this community, the children who are children of Mattapan or children of Rosendale or children of Hyde Park. They can't buy homes in these communities, and they can't rent in these communities, so they're losing.
Yeah, there's no longevity.
Yeah, and they're losing their ties to the community that raised them.
Yeah. But the other piece though is one of the areas that I'm particularly concerned about is the support of the current system in this gentrification effort. Like for instance, allowing crime to happen in certain neighborhoods, so people will become frustrated and because we're all concerned about our fear, our safety. We're all fearful of our safety.
That's a universal human concern.
Exactly. Especially when it comes down to my wife and my kids.
Yep.
So if I'm out working and and she's home and they're home, and I have all this safety, all this issue happening around my home, I'm concerned about that. Maybe I will consider selling and moving on. So
it's the word saying allowing crime, because then you're going to have this pushback. Well, we're not allowing crime. We're actively enforcing crime everywhere. But are you?
I think so. If I could just touch on that.
Yeah.
Part of it for me is from a holistic standpoint, which is how I like to look at issues, right? If you go to a class and you're hungry because you don't have food in your fridge, and you're sleeping on a friend's couch because you don't have a home, and so we failed you in 2 different places, and then you got to come and study for the MCAS, then you're probably not going to do too well studying for the MCAS. And so holistically, if I wanted to address this child is ability to participate in school, I'd have to address the fact that they have a housing issue and that they have an issue with whether it's income or whatever's happening that's keeping them from getting groceries. Right? And so holistically, you can't solve any of these problems without doing that. When I look at our neighborhoods that aren't receiving resources, there's an outcome to that. There's an outcome when you prevent or don't budget into a neighborhood the resources required for that neighborhood. There's a disparate effect. If I provide housing, if I provide education at levels I'm supposed to provide education, if I provide, if it's not a food desert, right? If there's all these different things that are happening, then the outcomes in general should be favorable. And by that token, if you're not providing those things, whether by design or because it's not a priority or whatever the reason is, then you're going to get the opposite outcome. You're going to get lower performing students. You're going to get less safe neighborhoods. And so, I think that there is a role that government plays in making sure that they're lifting up communities, because the opposite of that is not funding them and not putting their budget where it needs to be in certain neighborhoods. And when it comes to BPS, 87 or 85% of our students are Black or Latino. And so when you're underfunding BPS, you're underfunding at vast majority rates the children from our minority
inner city communities.
Yeah,
absolutely. And which means that those kids cannot compete on the world market or even on the national market. You're handicapping them. And so I do hear, and I like the holistic perspective, by the way. I do hear, how are we funding, but I also think that, along with the funding, we have to change our paradigm, especially in our education, to a point where we're educating people to work in a 21st century industry as opposed to educating people to be, workers or worker bees in a 20th century industry. I think a part of our education system in America in certain communities have not made that paradigm shift. They haven't shifted in that way. And I look at schools in my neighborhood. I'm saying to myself, okay, I understand these core courses, but how about the courses around computer science? How about the courses around robotics? How about the courses around structural engineering? How about the courses around computer engineering? So all these things that are going to be permanent agencies, you know, in the 21st century, our kids are not learning those things, but we are learning things that are either are moving away offshore.
Yep.
Those practices that are moving offshore to the
service industry, essentially.
Exactly. We're not dealing with those science type industries to condition our kids to work in the 21st century.
So I've always wanted civics courses in schools, right? That's separate. But in terms of
in fact, I did my dissertation on that, but we could definitely go there.
Yeah, because I went through my time in Boston Public Schools, started in the 90s, early 90s, went all the way up until 2006. And so, you know, my only computer class that I ever had was in 4th grade at the Sarah Greenwood, and it was a typing class. So we learned how to type. Now, because I have nieces and nephews in the school system, my sister's a Boston Public School teacher. My mother was one for 30 years, so she retired, you know, within the last 5 or 6 years. I know that we don't have coding classes. I know that there's these industries that revolve around engineering and coding that we don't have a uniform policy. Some schools may have something in coding, but it's not part of the curriculum in all of our schools. And so there's a lot of work that can be made up and ground that can be made up in training our students to be part of a workforce. And, you know, I also go back to the vocations. You know, we have Madison Park. Madison Park is going through some tough times. It feels like it's always been going through some tough times because I went to the O'Brien, so I was next door. And, you know, we're in a situation now where we're not supporting accurately or adequately the vocational schools. Right, we have Madison Park. It's the only vocational school that we have, and I don't think anybody would say that it's at where it needs to be.
It's been a problem for years. I don't understand why they haven't done as well as they have. You know, they've kind of left it to languish. I think it's gone through 4 headmasters. What's wrong with this? It's
gone through quite a few. And when I was at the O'Brien, it seemed like it was in upheaval, and that was in the early 2000s, right? It felt like, I think we had they had a principal for quite some time, and then he left, and then since then it hasn't been very stable. And, you know, for me, I think when we're talking about funding education, we're talking about making it so that there's more teachers. I know that one of the major complaints that the teachers in my life always had was there's one teacher per like 30 students or whatever it is, 26, when generally speaking, if you go to private institutions, you're talking about 2 teachers, you're talking about para teachers in those rooms, and they just don't have those kind of resources, and so their attention's stretched in a bunch of different directions, which is part of the doing more with less.
Yeah, well, you know, in addition to that, it handicaps the education, the process of education, because if you have one student or 2 who are acting in such a way that is drawing that teacher's attention to that individual, education stops. So it seems like, to me, it just feels like the process is built in such a way where you're severely handicapping the person who wants to get the education, because you know you don't give us the necessary laws and tools to deal with the most recalcitrant, difficult child. At the same time, you're telling me that I have to actually teach in order to pass this MCAS. So at what point, when the child starts to act up in the classroom, at what point can we remove that child to continue the teaching?
Well, I think part of the issue, right, goes back to the social workers and the guidance counselors that we don't have resources for. Any child who isn't, you know, behaviorally sound, right? Any child who is either acting up or disrupting a classroom, or you know, not taking to their lessons and making it a more difficult learning process for other children. We're talking about children, and so there's something there, something that needs to be addressed, and we don't currently have the tools for that teacher to actually do anything other than to put that child out of the school system, which is then further handicapping that child. And so for me, when I talk about fully funding education, I don't just mean books and teachers. I also mean those support services
There you go.
that make for healthy children.
Have healthy children and healthy environment that's conducive to
Precisely,
learning.
conducive to learning.
Yeah,
and if you don't have
absolutely.
that, then you're creating a situation where the children who are most at risk, the children who are dealing with whatever it may be, because maybe they're acting out because they're dealing with something undiagnosed, or maybe they're acting out because their home situation
It's
is
so
volatile.
stressful. Yeah, exactly. Maybe they
It's a cry for help.
Yeah,
And so, you know, there's a certain level of resources that we should be giving those children that we're not. And then when you don't do that, then you're taking away from children who may come from more stable households, but are now in a classroom with children who may not be able to sit still or pay attention or behave appropriately because they're in such volatile situations of their own.
Yeah, and it's a proven fact that people don't learn in environments that are dangerous, or they feel threatened, or they feel that, you know, my life is I have to fight to get into school and fight to get out of school, you know. So that type of environment is not conducive to learning. So there's another area around safety and climate, you know, that has to be thought through and funded, and that's something that they tend to put to the wayside when they're saying they're doing budget cuts. We're only providing for the bare minimum. Unfortunately, the bare minimum is not enough to make our kids, you know, competitive, you know, in the world marketplace in the 21st century. So I do think that we need to shift our whole paradigm around how we're educating, what we're educating our kids on. I think it's important because the industry from yesteryear, from the 20th century, is not very prevalent in the 21st century.
No, and it's constantly changing,
Yeah,
right? So,
exactly.
you know, if you're preparing a student now in first, second, third grade, the world that they see when they're a senior or junior in high school is going to be very different than the world that they're being trained in right now.
Exactly. So you have
That
to
was definitely certainly
yeah.
true in my
Yeah,
lifetime.
mine as well. Yeah, you hear something?
No. Just a thought. So right now we have the Stop and Shop. They're on strike.
Yes.
Okay. And I was thinking about Grove Hall because the only supermarket right
Stop
now
and Shop is
Yep.
is Stop and Shop. And most of us, okay, we have poor people up there.
Yep.
Okay.
That's my brother's Stop and Shop, by the way. My brother Ernesto, he's the one right above me. He actually made a post about this, that he's going to respect the picket lines. But that was where
Exactly.
he went.
Exactly. Okay. So, you know, that's poor people live around there.
Yep.
That's the only Stop and Shop. That's the only supermarket there. Where are they supposed to go? There's no Shaw's. There's no Star or anything. So
There's no market basket.
There's no market basket. Okay. So, you know, what does respect the line mean to these people here? Unless you are actually someone who works for a union. Okay. You know, me, when I went to Market Basket, and when they
Yep.
were on strike, I went to Stop and Shop and I went to Star or Shaw's. Okay, so now I'm not going to Stop and Shop. But what are these people going to do?
You know,
What are they going to do? Because there's nothing close. There's nothing nearby. The closest next Stop and Shop is on. Well, no,
there's two Stop and Shops that are close by. That's what they got. They got the South Bay one, and then they got the one on American Legion, which is in my district.
Okay, or Freeport Street. So you're not going to anyone. So now I don't even know where there's a Shaw's.
Oh, by the old Boston Globe.
There's a Star
That's
Market
gone.
by the.
There's a Star Market
there's a
over
Star
there.
Market there.
Yeah.
Right by the JFK UMass.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So where are they going?
Well,
to
my
shop?
hope would be that they get the contract that they're looking for soon. You know, I think it's irresponsible when a corporation like Stop and Shop is making $2 billion in profit, but then telling essentially their workers, we can't give you a contract unless we cut your take-home pay or we cut your healthcare benefits. All right, and so I think that speaks to kind of the system that we live in, where corporations will negotiate the way they want to negotiate because they feel that they can. And I do applaud Stop and Shop workers for standing up and fighting for a contract that's fair to them. I think on an effect of the corporation and the union not getting what they're supposed to get is we have this situation that we're talking about right now with Grove Hall, which is, there are going to be folks that can't, either they don't have a vehicle, or they don't have the ability and time or just health to go further than that Grove Hall Stop and Shop. And so I understand that puts people in a difficult position. And even as you say that, I've been running through the grocery stores, but I think this goes back to, what we were talking about earlier, which is which communities have these choices and which ones don't. And there's certain communities that just don't have a bevy of grocery store choices, right? And then there's others that do. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that go into design of policy and why these communities are considered communities that can sustain more than one grocery store when everybody's got to eat, right? And so there's a lot of different things that go into that. But I know my brother posted about this because that's the one that, that was about 5-10 minutes from his home. And that's the one that he's no longer able to go to. Right. And so that's going to be an ongoing issue. And I just hope they resolve that contract dispute soon.
Soon, because like I said, if you don't have a vehicle, okay, and the next market isn't easy for you to get to, at least by tea, you're stuck. You're stuck. Brandon Ransom says nonprofits are attempting to fill the gap as of now. Places like the Timothy Smith Network and MPDC are subsidizing the local ed experience with free tech ed opportunities. There is a need to systematize these opportunities. The testing environment in this country prevents the systemic integration of more innovative curriculum elements. Secondary ed structures are what are filling the gap as of now, but we tend to suck at advertising because of limited funding connections to educational institutions.
Speaking of limited funding for education institutions, what are your thoughts around pilot and charter schools?
So for me, I grew up when we started with pilots. My little brother went to a pilot, which was the Mission Hill High. But at the time he wasn't in high school, though. He ended up going to Boston Arts Academy. Okay. But in terms of the charter school structure, right, where charter schools are essentially the money that's going into charter schools is not getting reciprocated back into Boston Public Schools. I have a major issue with that. When we're talking about taking steps towards privatization of education, I got to be honest, I don't think that I can think of an example where we've privatized something and it's actually become better. I can't, because essentially the privatization of it, the idea is that it saves costs or it does whatever it does. But the point of saving costs is to not provide costs where it needs to be provided. You get what you pay for, essentially. And so I think about the efforts that they've taken to privatize the MPTA and how that hasn't worked out the way that I think anybody would want that to work out. And so for charters, for me, when you have this money coming in, that when you're trying to make profits, when you have folks that are running these institutions and then the money's not going back in. And one of my major peeves with it, if I'm gonna be honest, is the zero tolerance policy that most of these schools carry. And the reason I say that is Black and brown children are over policed on a daily basis. And what they don't need is more of that. And so when you're suspending upwards of 20-25% of your student body, when you have an attrition rate that they have at a lot of these schools, there's cause for concern for me. That's not a welcome learning environment. Part of the issue for me too is, and I'm speaking more towards when the ones that I've looked at, and I recognize that in Massachusetts with the cap, some of these have worked better. But when I was in Chicago, I saw the charter school sector, and what they were doing was largely pulling folks out who had English as a second language issues, because they weren't going to perform well on exams. They were pulling folks out who had health or learning disabilities because they weren't performing well on exams, and that's where the attrition rate comes from. And so for me, when you're talking about, in Chicago, there's a school that celebrates graduating something like 100% of their graduation class goes to college. What they don't tell you is it's less than 50% of their graduation of the class that started. And so that means that you got about 50% of your students didn't. And so there's an issue for me when we do that. And I know part of it too is the way that they do funding currently is if somebody leaves a charter school and goes to a Boston public school, right, halfway through the year, the charter school keeps the money that was given to them for that student, because we fund currently in a way where we fund per student. And that money doesn't come back to BPS. And so the charter schools are essentially straining BPS budgets more so than we were before.
Yeah, which is why I asked the question, because that is one of my issues here. See, and I see it as a way of perpetuating or supporting, I should say, a better word, gentrification. Because I think when you're paying $2,500 a month for a one-bedroomer, or $5,000 a month for two-bedroomers, I am not sending my child to a dysfunctional school system. So charter schools create that extra layer for people who are actually not in the upper, not among the one percenters, but making enough money to afford, $5,000 for a two-bedroom. So I have to have my education system or academic institution that's going to be able to educate my child. So that's one piece. The other piece, I think it makes the public school system more of a reformatory type school, because the public school system can't, prevent that. They can't engage in zero tolerance. They can't, because the law says you have to educate this child.
Precisely.
You know what I mean? And the law says that you cannot, on the DESE, you cannot use suspension as the main vehicle of discipline. You have to come up with other ways. So what are we doing with the kids in the classroom that are causing problems and disrupting education? Because you have hamstring through the law the administrators of the public school systems. So I have issues with the fact that the private school is dealing with, the charter school doesn't have to pay attention to a law that the public school has to pay attention to. That's my hit. And I think it's not only it is the funding. You're absolutely correct.
A big part of it for me is the funding, and part of it is I understand the argument that a parent of somebody who's at a charter school would make, and part of it is this: when you have your child, you want your child to receive the best education available to them. And if you're being told that this school is going to provide a better education for them than this school will, then you're going to want your child in that school.
Absolutely.
And so I think there's a number of issues where, there's a group of folks that have been failed by public education, and they don't forget that they were failed by public education. And the issue for me is public education has never been fully funded. I remember when we were fighting for art classes. I remember when we were fighting for gym classes and physical education classes, and we constantly were losing those either curriculums or resources or the ability to take a field trip and do something out of class. Those things were constantly under assault budget wise, and so when you're doing that, languages, all these different things, we never fully funded education. And then when you say, well, look, education isn't working the way you want it to, so we're going to create this this public-private thing, which is charters. And they're going to take more of that money away from the public schools, which is causing a lot of the issues that we're not fully funding it. And they're going to put it into this school, but it's going to be okay because this charter school is also going to be privately funded, and it's going to generate profits for some folks.
Right.
That's problematic for me on a number of different levels. There's certain things I don't think should be privatized. One of those is prisons is another one. We luckily in Massachusetts that's not much of an issue.
But I agree with that. I mean, we're definitely in agreement on that. There's things that should not be privatized. Schools, prisons, the services that I think are essential, that it remain under the public domain. But right now we have to, unfortunately, just conclude the conversation. Conclude the conversation so that we can actually
it sure was.
Move on.
We're going to give you the last 2 minutes before we're going to have to shut this down.
Well, I appreciate both of you for having me here today. I appreciate Terrence for his call. And for me, I'm running for the Boston City Council District 5. That's from Mattapan, Rosendale, Hyde Park. I'm running to be somebody who works with community and collaboration and partnership. I'm not running to replace anybody's voice. When I was in courts as a public defender, there were folks that, by law aren't able to speak, but frankly never felt like anybody was fighting for them or saw them. And for me, when I go to our communities, I see the same thing. There's folks who feel unseen. There's folks who feel unheard. Or when they are heard, that it's not genuine. I know Terrence raised that in his phone call. And so for me, I'm running to change that. I'm running to disrupt the systems that cause imbalance and inequity. I'm running to do what I can as part of my role as service on earth to make the communities that raised me, Hyde Park, Mattapan, and Rosendale, stronger and better. We have neighborhood displacement coming in, and I think it's important that we have somebody in office who's willing to call gentrification what it is and to stand up for our neighborhoods and our communities and making sure that we're doing what we can to keep folks in their homes.
Amen.
And so I'm running to be a person who is part of the solution for this, for these neighborhoods, and is part of the advocacy that they require. And I'm hoping that folks can vote on September 24th for me, frankly. And that's September 24th of 2019 in Mattapan, Rosendale, and Hyde Park.
Okay, with that, we are on break. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. See you next